You were not created small, weak, confused, or defeated. You were not designed to merely survive, to drift through life reacting to circumstances, waiting for permission to become who God already called you to be. There is a force placed inside you before you ever took your first breath, a divine capacity planted by the Creator himself. It is not loud. It is not flashy. It does not announce itself with thunder, yet it carries the power to shift destinies, break cycles, heal wounds, unlock favor, and transform ordinary moments into divine encounters. The tragedy is not that this power does not exist. The tragedy is that most people live their entire lives without ever activating it. Somewhere along the journey of life, disappointment taught you to shrink. Fear trained you to play safe. Pain convinced you to lower your expectations. Voices around you told you what you could not be, what you should not attempt, what was realistic. Slowly, layer by layer, the awareness of what God placed inside you became buried under survival mode, routine, and quiet resignation. You began to live from memory instead of promise, from history instead of destiny, from limitation instead of calling. Yet nothing about heaven's investment in you has changed. What God deposited in you is still alive, still potent, still waiting to be engaged. You were never designed to live beneath your calling or shrink your expectations to match your fears. From the moment God formed you, he placed within you a divine capacity that exceeds what your natural mind can fully comprehend. This capacity is not dependent on your background, education, social status, or past mistakes. It is rooted in God's intention, not human limitation. Yet many people live as though they were created merely to survive, to cope, to endure, rather than to influence, transform, and build. The tragedy is not that power is missing from their lives, but that it remains dormant because they have accepted a smaller version of themselves than what God originally designed. Life has a way of conditioning the soul. Rejection teaches people to hide. Failure trains them to avoid risk. Pain convinces them to lower their expectations. Over time, the heart learns to operate in self-protection rather than faith. Dreams become quieter, vision becomes narrower, and courage slowly erodes into comfort and routine. What once felt possible begins to feel unrealistic, even irresponsible. Yet none of these experiences change what God planted inside you. The seed of divine purpose remains alive even when buried under disappointment and doubt. Just because you cannot currently see growth does not mean life is not present beneath the surface. You were created in the image of a limitless God, which means you were never meant to think, speak, or live from a place of scarcity. Divine capacity means you were equipped with the ability to grow beyond your current environment, rise above inherited limitations, and walk into assignments that stretch your comfort but expand your impact. When you reduce yourself to what you have experienced instead of what God has promised, you allow history to override destiny. Your past may explain your wounds, but it does not define your future. Your upbringing may shape your perspective, but it does not restrict your calling. God's design always exceeds human labels. Many people unconsciously adopt identities based on what they have survived rather than what they were created for. They see themselves as broken, average, unlucky, overlooked, or incapable instead of chosen, empowered, equipped, and purposeful. This internal narrative quietly shapes their decisions. They avoid opportunities because they feel unqualified. They settle for relationships that diminish their worth. They tolerate cycles that God intended to break, not because they lack ability, but because they underestimate what lives inside them. When you see yourself small, you live small. When you see yourself limited, you make limited choices. But when your identity aligns with God's truth, your behavior begins to rise to match that revelation. Divine capacity does not mean life will be easy or free from struggle. It means you were built with the spiritual, emotional, and mental strength necessary to grow through adversity rather than be crushed by it. It means resilience is wired into your spirit. It means you carry adaptability, creativity, wisdom, and endurance as surface when pressure demands it. Often people discover what they are truly capable of only when circumstances force them beyond comfort. What once felt impossible becomes achievable when faith replaces fear and obedience replaces hesitation. God never calls people based on their current ability. He calls them based on what he placed inside them. Throughout history, ordinary individuals stepped into extraordinary impact, not because they were perfect, but because they trusted God's capacity more than their insecurity. When you recognize that God's power operates through willing vessels rather than flawless ones, the pressure to perform disappears and the freedom to obey emerges. Your responsibility is not to impress, but to trust, grow, and remain faithful to the process. Living beneath your divine capacity often shows up subtly. You procrastinate on dreams that require courage. You silence ideas that challenge comfort. You avoid responsibility because growth feels demanding. You remain in familiar patterns even when they no longer serve your purpose. You delay obedience because you wait for confidence instead of allowing obedience to build confidence. Each small compromise reinforces limitation until it becomes normal. But the moment you begin to challenge these internal boundaries, something shifts. Your perspective expands. Your faith strengthens. Your confidence stabilizes. Your hunger for growth increases. God's capacity in you is activated through intentional alignment, renewing your mind, guarding your words, disciplining your habits, and choosing faith over fear daily. Growth rarely arrives through sudden transformation alone. It unfolds through consistent small decisions that align you with truth rather than emotion. When you begin to treat yourself as someone entrusted with divine potential, you steward your time differently, speak more intentionally, choose healthier environments, and pursue growth even when no one applauds. You were never meant to measure your worth by comparison. Someone else's success does not diminish your assignment. Your pace does not invalidate your progress. Your process does not disqualify your calling. God develops each life uniquely, shaping character before releasing influence. When you embrace your own journey instead of competing with others, you free yourself to grow authentically and sustainably. Divine capacity also carries responsibility. You are accountable for what you cultivate and what you neglect. God will not force you into growth. He invites you into partnership. The more you stretch your faith, the more capacity expands. The more you exercise obedience, the more authority develops. The more you confront fear, the more courage strengthens. Capacity increases when used, not when avoided. You are far more capable than your doubts suggest. You are stronger than your setbacks imply. You are more equipped than your past reflects. God's design for your life exceeds the ceilings you may have unconsciously accepted. When you begin to believe this truth deeply, your decisions begin to align with destiny rather than limitation. You stop waiting for permission to become who God already created you to be. You rise not because circumstances change, but because your identity shifts. And once your identity aligns with heaven's truth, your life naturally begins to reflect the power that has been within you all along. Faith was never meant to remain a quiet belief, locked head. Inside the heart, it was designed to move, to act, to obey, and to transform daily behavior. Many people sincerely believe in God, pray regularly, and desire breakthrough, yet their lives remain stagnant because belief has not translated into action. Faith becomes powerful only when it steps beyond comfort and expresses itself through obedience. Until faith moves your feet, shapes your habits, changes your speech, and governs your decisions, it remains potential rather than power. Obedience is the bridge between what you believe and what you experience. It is easy to agree with truth intellectually while resisting it practically. People often say they trust God, yet they cling tightly to control, fear, and familiar patterns. They ask for growth but avoid discomfort. They pray for open doors but refuse to walk through the ones already available. They desire spiritual maturity but resist the discipline that produces it. Faith without action becomes passive hope rather than living confidence. God's power flows most freely through surrendered hearts. Obedience is not about perfection or religious performance. It is about alignment. When your actions align with God's direction, you position yourself for divine partnership. Every act of obedience invites heaven's influence into your natural environment. When you forgive instead of holding bitterness, you release spiritual freedom. When you give instead of hoarding, you activate trust. When you speak truth instead of fear, you shift atmosphere. When you choose integrity over convenience, you build spiritual authority that protects and elevates your future. Many people misunderstand obedience as restriction, but obedience is actually empowerment. It protects you from unnecessary pain, redirects you from destructive cycles, and sharpens your discernment. Obedience strengthens spiritual sensitivity and builds confidence in hearing God's voice. Each time you obey, even when the instruction feels small or inconvenient, your trust deepens and your courage expands. You begin to recognize that God's wisdom surpasses your understanding and that surrender multiplies peace rather than diminishing freedom. Fear is often the greatest obstacle to obedient faith. Fear of failure, rejection, disappointment, loss, or uncertainty convinces people to delay obedience until conditions feel safer. But faith rarely feels safe. It feels stretching. It often requires stepping forward before clarity fully arrives. If you wait until you feel completely ready, you may never move at all. Courage grows through action, not waiting. Confidence develops by walking through fear, not avoiding it. God honors movement more than comfort. Obedience also confronts pride and self-reliance. It humbles the ego and reminds the heart that God's perspective is higher than human logic. Sometimes obedience makes little sense emotionally or socially, yet its long-term fruit reveals divine wisdom. Many breakthroughs are hidden behind instructions that seem ordinary or uncomfortable. A conversation you avoid, a habit you delay changing, a discipline you resist forming, a boundary you hesitate to establish. These small acts of obedience often carry massive impact over time. Faith expressed through obedience transforms your internal world before it transforms your external circumstances. Your character strengthens, your discernment sharpens, your discipline stabilizes, your peace deepens, your confidence matures. You become less reactive and more intentional. You stop living emotionally driven and begin living purpose-driven. When internal alignment occurs, external results naturally follow. God often changes the person before changing the situation because sustained breakthrough requires mature character. Obedience also releases spiritual momentum. One faithful step creates clarity for the next. One obedient decision builds confidence for greater responsibility. Small acts of faith compound into long-term transformation. Many people underestimate the power of consistency. They want instant miracles but neglect daily obedience. Yet God often builds lasting impact slowly, layering faith upon faith, discipline upon discipline, trust upon trust. Momentum grows when obedience becomes lifestyle rather than occasional response. Another reason people struggle with obedience is distraction. Noise, busyness, entertainment, pressure, and constant stimulation dulls spiritual sensitivity. When life becomes crowded with activity, the still voice of conviction becomes easier to ignore. Obedience requires intentional listening, reflection, prayer, and humility. When you slow down enough to hear God clearly, your confidence in obeying increases because direction becomes more recognizable and less confusing. Obedience also challenges comfort zones. Growth always requires stretching. Muscles strengthen through resistance. Faith strengthens through risk. If your faith never requires courage, it may not be growing. When you consistently choose what is right over what is easy, you build spiritual endurance. You learn that temporary discomfort often produces long-term freedom. You stop chasing short-term relief and begin investing in long-term purpose. God does not ask for obedience to control you, but to partner with you. He sees what you cannot yet see. He understands consequences you cannot yet measure. His instructions carry protection, preparation, and positioning for future assignments. Obedience aligns you with divine timing and divine favor. When you move in step with God, you avoid unnecessary detours that drain energy, delay growth, and complicate progress. As obedience becomes habit, faith matures into confidence rather than emotional fluctuation. You stop being driven by feelings and start being anchored in conviction. You learn to trust God's faithfulness even when outcomes take time. Your spiritual authority strengthens because your life reflects consistency rather than contradiction. People trust what you carry because they see stability rather than impulsiveness. Ultimately, faith becomes power when it is lived, not merely spoken. Your daily choices either activate or suppress what God placed inside you. Each obedient step strengthens alignment between heaven's intention and your earthly experience. The more you practice obedience, the more natural faith becomes. You begin to recognize that obedience is not loss, but access to peace, clarity, growth, protection, influence, and divine partnership. When belief becomes behavior, faith becomes force, and your life begins to reflect the power that has always been available within you, your life will always move in the direction of what you consistently focus on. Attention is not a small thing. It is a powerful foe. RCE that shapes identity, habits, emotional patterns, and long-term outcomes. Many people unknowingly give their best energy to distractions, worries, comparisons, entertainment, and noise, then wonder why their purpose feels distant and their progress feels slow. Focus is not merely about productivity, it is spiritual alignment. What you choose to concentrate on determines what grows within you and what gradually fades away. Discipline is the structure that protects focus. Without discipline, even good intentions collapse under pressure, fatigue, and temptation. Motivation fluctuates, but discipline sustains movement when feelings are unreliable. When you train yourself to consistently choose what aligns with your purpose rather than what feels easiest in the moment, you build internal strength that carries you through seasons of resistance. Discipline trains your mind to obey truth instead of impulse. It teaches your emotions to follow conviction rather than control it. The enemy rarely destroys destiny directly. He weakens it slowly through distraction, busyness, constant stimulation, endless scrolling, comfort, entertainment, and unnecessary commitments fragment attention and drain clarity. When your mind becomes scattered, your spiritual sensitivity dulls. When your schedule becomes overcrowded, your priorities blur. When your emotions remain overstimulated, your peace weakens. Distraction does not always look dangerous. Often it looks harmless, convenient, and socially acceptable. Yet over time, it quietly erodes consistency, discipline, prayer life, creativity, and focus. What you repeatedly think about shapes how you interpret life. Thoughts influence beliefs. Beliefs influence choices, and choices shape destiny. If your focus stays locked on fear, scarcity, failure, and comparison, your internal world will begin to mirror those patterns. Anxiety grows where worry is fed. Insecurity strengthens where comparison is entertained. Faith weakens where negativity dominates. But when your attention is intentionally redirected toward truth, gratitude, growth, vision, and obedience, your mindset begins to shift. You become more resilient, hopeful, disciplined, and emotionally stable. Discipline also teaches you to delay gratification. Many people sacrifice long-term growth for short-term comfort. They choose rest when discipline is needed, entertainment when focus is required, avoidance when courage is demanded. Over time, these small compromises accumulate into stagnation. But when you learn to prioritize what matters most rather than what feels easiest, you build momentum. Progress may feel slow at first, but consistency compounds into visible transformation. Focus requires intentional boundaries. Not every opportunity deserves your energy. Not every voice deserves your attention. Not every relationship deserves your emotional investment. Without boundaries, you leak energy into unnecessary conflicts, distractions, and obligations that dilute purpose. Saying no becomes an act of stewardship rather than selfishness. Protecting your time, mind, and energy allows you to invest deeply in what truly matters instead of shallowly in everything. Your daily routines reveal what you truly value. Habits quietly shape identity. If your mornings begin with chaos, rush, and distraction, your mind remains reactive throughout the day. If your me lacks structure, your growth becomes inconsistent. But when you intentionally build rhythms of prayer, reflection, learning, discipline, and rest, your internal world stabilizes. Structure does not restrict freedom, it protects progress. Mental discipline is especially critical. You cannot always control what enters your mind, but you can control what stays. Negative thoughts, doubts, fears, temptations, and distractions will inevitably appear, but you decide whether to entertain or redirect them. Training your mind to refocus quickly strengthens emotional health and spiritual clarity. The more you practice mental discipline, the easier it becomes to maintain peace and concentration under pressure. Consistency strengthens identity. When you repeatedly show up for your growth, your confidence stabilizes. You stop relying on emotional motivation and begin trusting your disciplined character. Your self-respect increases because your actions align with your values. You begin to trust yourself again. This internal alignment builds credibility in both spiritual and practical life. People are drawn to stability, not chaos. Influence grows where discipline lives. Focus also impacts spiritual sensitivity. When your life is cluttered with noise and busyness, God's voice becomes harder to discern. Stillness sharpens clarity. Simplicity strengthens awareness. When you slow down intentionally, remove unnecessary distractions, and create space for reflection, your spiritual alignment deepens. Direction becomes clearer. Conviction becomes sharper. Peace becomes more consistent. Focus protects your connection with God. Discipline does not mean perfection. It means persistence. You will have days when focus weakens and habits slip. The key is not condemnation, but correction. Growth is built through course adjustment, not quitting. Each time you return to discipline after failure, you strengthen resilience. Over time, your capacity expands and your consistency stabilizes. When focus and discipline become lifestyle rather than occasional effort, your destiny accelerates. You waste less time recovering from distraction and more time building momentum. You gain clarity about what truly matters. You experience deeper peace because your mind is less scattered. Your productivity increases not because you rush more, but because you align better. Your spiritual authority strengthens because your life reflects intentional stewardship. Your future will not be shaped by one dramatic decision alone, but by thousands of small, focused choices repeated daily. Every time you choose discipline over distraction, clarity over chaos, purpose over comfort, you strengthen your alignment with destiny. Focus is not about intensity, it is about consistency. Discipline is not about pressure, it is about protection. When you steward your attention wisely, you unlock a powerful force that steadily reshapes your life in the direction God designed for you. You were created to contribute, not merely to consume. Embedded within your spirit is a creative capacity that reflects the nature of God himself. Creativity is not limited to art, music, or public platforms. It expresses itself through problem solving, leadership, service, innovation, teaching, caregiving, entrepreneurship, encouragement, and vision. Wherever there is a need for improvement, order, healing, or growth, creativity becomes a divine tool. God did not design you to simply repeat what already exists. He designed you to bring something into existence that carries his fingerprint through your obedience. Many people suppress their creative power without realizing it. Fear whispers that you are not talented enough. Comparison convinces you that someone else is more gifted. Past failures persuade you that your efforts will not matter. Criticism silences initiative. Comfort discourages risk. Slowly, potential becomes buried beneath hesitation and self-doubt. Yet creativity is not about perfection. It is about faithfulness. God does not ask you to outperform others. He asks you to steward what he placed inside you. When you honor the seed rather than compare the harvest, growth becomes natural. Creativity flows best when obedience leads the process. When you create in alignment with God, your work carries purpose beyond personal success. It becomes a channel through which solutions emerge, hope spreads, and lives are influenced. Whether your creativity impacts one person or thousands, its value is measured by obedience, not visibility. Many divine assignments operate quietly behind the scenes, yet they hold eternal significance. When you release what God gives you, instead of withholding it out of fear, you allow heaven to touch earth through your faithfulness. Unexpressed creativity does not remain neutral. It often becomes frustration, restlessness, boredom, or dissatisfaction. When people ignore their creative calling, they may feel stuck even when circumstances appear stable. The soul longs to fulfill its purpose. Creative obedience brings alignment between inner desire and outward action. It awakens passion, renews energy, and strengthens confidence. When you step into what you were designed to build or contribute, life gains clarity and momentum. Creativity also requires courage. It exposes you to vulnerability because your ideas, work, and effort become visible. Not everyone will understand or affirm your process. Some may criticize what they do not comprehend, but approval cannot become the foundation of purpose. If you wait for universal validation before creating, you will remain silent forever. Growth requires risk. Confidence grows through movement. Skill develops through practice. Mastery emerges through patience. Obedience builds maturity over time. God often uses ordinary people to produce extraordinary impact. through consistent creative obedience. You do not need perfect conditions, unlimited resources, or flawless confidence to begin. You only need willingness. Small beginnings carry powerful potential. Seeds always look insignificant before they become trees. When you honor the process instead of rushing the outcome, you allow growth to mature naturally. Every step forward compounds into greater clarity, skill, and influence. Creativity also serves others. What you carry is not only for you, it answers someone else's prayer, solves someone else's problem, inspires someone else's hope, or strengthens someone else's faith. When you withhold your gift, the world misses access to what God intended to flow through you. Your obedience becomes someone else's breakthrough. Your consistency becomes someone else's encouragement. Your courage becomes someone else's permission to step forward. Comparison is one of the great enemies of creative freedom. When you measure your progress against someone else's highlight, you distort your perspective. Your assignment, timeline, resources, and process are uniquely designed for you. God does not duplicate callings, he customizes them. When you embrace your individuality rather than compete with others, creativity flows with greater peace and authenticity. You stop striving to impress and begin serving with sincerity. Creativity also thrives in discipline. Inspiration alone cannot sustain progress. Consistent effort, learning, practice, structure, and refinement transform raw potential into effective impact. When you commit to growing your craft, sharpening your skills, and stewarding your time wisely, your creative power strengthens. Excellence honors the gift. Discipline protects momentum. Patience builds sustainability. Fear often disguises itself as wisdom, waiting for better timing, more resources, more confidence, or more clarity. But clarity often comes after obedience, not before it. Confidence grows through experience, not avoidance. Provision follows movement. When you step forward in faith, doors begin to open, connections align, and opportunities emerge. God honors action rooted in trust. Creative obedience also develops humility. You learn that growth takes time. You learn to receive correction without losing confidence. You learn to celebrate progress without arrogance. You learn to remain teachable even when skill increases. This balance protects your heart and strengthens your influence. When you fully embrace the creative power God placed inside you, your life becomes more than routine. It becomes contribution. Your day's car, Rai meaning beyond survival. Your efforts connect with eternal purpose. You stop asking only what benefits you and begin asking how you can serve, build, and bless. Your creativity becomes worship expressed through action. You were never meant to bury what God gave you out of fear, comparison, or comfort. You were designed to release it faithfully, grow it patiently, and steward it responsibly. When you create from obedience rather than insecurity, your life becomes a vessel through which God touches lives in ways you may never fully see. The world does not need more spectators. It needs faithful creators who dare to use what heaven entrusted to them. Your words are far more powerful than you may realize. They are not merely sounds you release into the air or tools for casual communication. They carry spiritual weight and creative influence. Every sentence you speak reinforces a direction for your mind, your emotions, and your decisions. Over time, your language shapes your identity, your expectations, and the atmosphere around you. Many people unknowingly weaken their own faith and delay their progress simply by consistently speaking defeat, fear, doubt, and limitation. What you speak repeatedly becomes what you eventually believe, and what you believe determines how you live. The human mind is designed to respond to repetition. When negative words are spoken frequently, the mind begins to accept them as truth, even when they contradict God's promises. Statements like, I can't, nothing ever changes, I always fail, or this will never work, quietly program discouragement and passivity into the heart. Over time, these declarations shape behavior, reducing risk-taking, weakening courage, and reinforcing stagnation. Many people pray for breakthrough while verbally rehearsing breakdown without realizing the internal conflict they create. Words also influence emotional health. When you speak with gratitude, hope, patience, and faith, your nervous system calms, your perspective stabilizes, and your resilience strengthens. But when your speech is dominated by complaint, criticism, bitterness, and fear, stress increases, clarity decreases, and peace becomes harder to maintain. Your mouth often becomes the doorway through which peace or anxiety enters your life. What you consistently say trains your emotions on how to respond to pressure. Spiritually, your words align you either with faith or with fear. When your speech agrees with God's truth, your spirit gains confidence and stability. You begin to expect growth instead of defeat, provision instead of lack, healing instead of despair, wisdom instead of confusion. Speaking truth does not mean denying reality. It means refusing to allow circumstances to dictate your identity or your future. You acknowledge challenges while declaring that God's promises remain greater than temporary conditions. Your words also shape relationships. The tone you carry influences how people feel in your presence. Encouraging language builds trust and connection. Respectful communication fosters safety and cooperation. Harsh or careless words create distance and damage intimacy. Many relational wounds are not caused by major events, but by repeated careless speech. When you learn to speak AK with intentional kindness, clarity, and integrity, your influence multiplies naturally. Another powerful aspect of speech is self-talk. What you say to yourself internally carries just as much weight as what you say aloud. Your internal dialogue either strengthens confidence or feeds insecurity. If you constantly criticize yourself, rehearse past failures, or magnify weaknesses, your motivation weakens and your joy erodes. But when you intentionally remind yourself of truth, progress, gratitude, and God's faithfulness, your mind becomes resilient. Healthy self-talk does not inflate ego. It anchors identity in truth. Many people wait for circumstances to change before changing their language, but transformation often begins with speech. When you shift what you say, you shift what you expect. When expectations change, behavior follows. When behavior aligns with truth, results begin to shift. Your words act like seeds planted into the soil of your heart. Over time, those seeds produce corresponding fruit, whether positive or negative. Discipline is required to govern speech. Emotional reactions often speak before wisdom has time to respond. Learning to pause, reflect, and choose words intentionally strengthens maturity. Silence can be more powerful than impulsive reaction. Thoughtful speech protects relationships, preserves peace, and strengthens credibility. When you practice restraint, you demonstrate self-leadership. Your words also influence spiritual atmosphere. Faith-filled speech invites courage, unity, and hope into environments. Negative speech releases tension, division, and discouragement. Homes, workplaces, and communities often reflect the language that dominates them. When you choose to speak life consistently, you become a carrier of peace and stability wherever you go. Gratitude is one of the most powerful expressions of positive speech. When you intentionally acknowledge what is good, your perspective shifts from lack to abundance. Gratitude strengthens joy, reduces anxiety, and increases contentment. It trains the mind to recognize God's faithfulness even during challenges. Thankfulness guards the heart from bitterness and entitlement. Speaking truth also strengthens faith during waiting seasons. Delays can tempt people to speak frustration and doubt. But when you continue declaring trust, patience, and hope, your spirit remains anchored. Your words become reminders of what you believe even when emotions fluctuate. Faith grows through consistent agreement with truth rather than emotional reaction. Your mouth is a gateway between your inner world and your external experience. It reveals what you truly believe and reinforces what you will become. When you intentionally align your speech with God's promises, your mindset strengthens, your confidence stabilizes, and your spiritual authority increases. You become more aware of your influence and more responsible with your language. You do not need perfect speech, but you need intentional speech. Growth begins when you notice patterns and begin replacing harmful language with life-giving truth. Over time, your atmosphere changes, your emotional health improves, your relationships strengthen, and your faith matures. Your words either build your future or weaken it. When you steward them wisely, you activate a powerful force that shapes your destiny from the inside out. Many people underestimate the power of endurance because they live in a culture that celebrates speed, instant results, and immediate gratification. When progress feels slow or invisible, discouragement quickly sets in and quitting begins to feel reasonable. Yet in the spiritual journey, consistency often matters more than intensity. Faithfulness over time produces depth, strength, stability, and credibility that cannot be manufactured overnight. Endurance is not merely the ability to survive hardship. It is the discipline to remain obedient, hopeful, and committed even when visible rewards delay. Growth rarely announces itself loudly. Much of what God develops happens quietly beneath the surface, shaping character, strengthening discipline, refining motives, and stabilizing faith. Like roots growing underground before a tree becomes visible, endurance builds unseen foundations that support future influence. When people abandon the process too early, they forfeit the fruit that was already forming. What feels like stagnation is often preparation in disguise. Endurance strengthens spiritual maturity. When you continue to pray without immediate answers, your trust deepens. When you keep serving without recognition, humility grows. When you remain faithful during uncertainty, your character stabilizes. These internal developments matter far more than temporary comfort. God often values who you are becoming more than how quickly you succeed. Breakthrough without maturity often creates instability, but endurance produces sustainability. Faithfulness compounds over time. Small, consistent choices, choosing integrity when no one sees, maintaining discipline when motivation fades, practicing kindness when it feels inconvenient, showing up when emotions resist, gradually accumulate into strong spiritual authority. Each faithful day adds weight to your character. Each obedient season builds credibility with God, with others, and with yourself. What looks insignificant in isolation becomes powerful when repeated consistently. Many people quit because they misinterpret delay as denial. They assume that unanswered prayers mean failure or rejection, but often delay simply means development. God prepares you internally for what he intends to release externally. Premature success can damage confidence, distort priorities, and weaken humility. Endurance teaches patience, wisdom, restraint, and dependence on God rather than performance. Endurance also develops emotional resilience. Life will inevitably bring disappointment, criticism, setbacks, and uncertainty. Without endurance, emotions become reactive and unstable. But when resilience grows, you learn to respond rather than react. You develop perspective. You learn to separate temporary emotions from long-term purpose. You stop allowing one difficult season to redefine your entire future. Consistency builds momentum even when progress feels invisible. Habits formed through discipline shape identity. Prayer builds spiritual strength even when answers delay. Learning increases wisdom even when immediate application seems unclear. Healthy routines stabilize emotional health even when external circumstances fluctuate. Over time, these consistent investments begin to reveal visible fruit. Endurance also guards against impulsive decision-making. When people become impatient, they often compromise, lose for shortcuts, settle for lesser opportunities, or abandon commitments prematurely. Endurance protects integrity. It keeps you anchored when emotions fluctuate and pressure increases. It teaches you to trust the process rather than manipulate outcomes. Faithfulness strengthens self-trust. When you consistently keep your commitments, your confidence stabilizes. You learn that you can rely on your own discipline rather than emotional motivation. This internal trust strengthens leadership capacity, decision-making clarity, and long-term consistency. You become less dependent on external validation and more anchored in internal conviction. God often uses seasons of waiting to clarify purpose. When noise quiets and progress slows, reflection deepens. You begin to evaluate motives, refine priorities, and strengthen spiritual alignment. Waiting seasons remove distractions and reveal what truly matters. They build gratitude for progress rather than entitlement for results. Endurance also multiplies influence. People are inspired by consistency, not hype. Stability builds trust. Faithfulness builds credibility. When others see you remain steady through storms, setbacks, and uncertainty, your life becomes a testimony of God's sustaining grace. Influence flows naturally from visible integrity and resilience. Quitting too early often prevents people from seeing how close they were to breakthrough. Many victories are preceded by the greatest resistance. Growth often intensifies just before transformation becomes visible. Endurance allows you to remain positioned for what God is preparing rather than stepping away prematurely. Endurance does not eliminate fatigue or emotion, but it teaches you how to manage them wisely. Rest becomes intentional rather than escapism. Recovery becomes strategic rather than avoidance. You learn to pace yourself for sustainability rather than burnout. Balance strengthens longevity. Faithfulness also protects perspective. When you commit long-term to growth, you stop measuring success by daily emotions and start measuring by long-term direction. You become patient with your own development. You celebrate progress rather than perfection. You recognize that maturity takes time and grace. Ultimately, endurance transforms ordinary obedience into extraordinary impact. What seems repetitive and mundane becomes the foundation for stability, trust, influence, and authority. God honors perseverance because it demonstrates genuine faith rather than temporary enthusiasm. When you continue to show up faithfully, praying, serving, learning, growing, loving, obeying, even when results are slow, you align yourself with divine timing and sustainable breakthrough. You are stronger than you realize. Your consistency is building something even when you cannot yet see it. Every faithful step matters. Every obedient choice compounds. When you refuse to quit, refuse to compromise, and refuse to lose hope, you activate a power that steadily reshapes your future. Endurance may not feel glamorous, but it carries the weight of lasting transformation and enduring impact. In a world filled with constant noise, urgency, and endless stimulation, stillness has become rare, yet it remains one of the most powerful spiritual disciplines. Many people move quickly from decision to decision, conversation to conversation, task to task, without creating space to listen, reflect, or discern. When life becomes loud externally, clarity becomes weak internally. Sensitivity to God's voice is not developed through activity alone, but through intentional quietness and attentiveness. When you slow down enough to listen, you allow divine wisdom to guide your steps instead of emotional impulse or external pressure. Stillness does not mean inactivity. It means intentional awareness. It is the posture of a heart that pauses to seek direction rather than rushing ahead in self-reliance. When you cultivate moments of quiet reflection, prayer, and meditation on truth, your spiritual sensitivity sharpens. You begin to recognize subtle promptings, gentle convictions, and quiet warnings that protect you from unnecessary mistake. Many regrets in life are not caused by lack of intelligence, but by ignoring inner conviction due to haste, fear, or distraction. A noisy mind struggles to discern truth clearly. Constant stimulation overwhelms the nervous system and reduces the ability to process information wisely. When the mind is overstimulated, emotions become reactive, patience weakens, and discernment dulls. Stillness calms the inner world, allowing perspective to stabilize. In quiet moments, thoughts slow down, motives become clearer, and priorities realign. Peace becomes a signal that you are aligned rather than rushed. Sensitivity to God's voice grows through consistency rather than occasional effort. When you regularly create space for silence and prayer, your ability to recognize God's guidance strengthens. Just as relationships deepen through intentional listening, spiritual connection grows through attentiveness. Over time, become more confident in distinguishing between emotional impulses, personal desires, and divine direction. Discernment becomes more intuitive because your spirit becomes trained to recognize truth. Stillness also strengthens humility. It reminds you that you do not have to control every outcome or rush every solution. It teaches patience and surrender. When you slow down, you acknowledge that wisdom often unfolds gradually rather than instantly. You learn to wait for clarity rather than forcing premature decisions. This humility protects you from impulsive mistakes and unnecessary complications. Many people avoid stillness because silence exposes internal tension, unresolved emotions, and hidden fears. Noise often becomes a coping mechanism to avoid self-reflection. But healing begins in honesty. Stillness allows you to confront what needs healing rather than suppressing it. When you bring hidden struggles into quiet reflection and prayer, emotional clarity and spiritual peace begin to emerge. Sensitivity to God's voice also protects relationships. When you pause before reacting, you respond with wisdom rather than emotion. Stillness gives space for empathy, patience, and thoughtful communication. Many relational conflicts escalate because people speak before listening or react before reflecting. A calm and attentive spirit fosters understanding and maturity. Stillness sharpens decision-making. When you learn to wait for peace and clarity, your choices become more aligned with long-term purpose rather than short-term emotion. Rushed decisions often carry unintended consequences. Stillness allows you to weigh motives, evaluate consequences, and seek divine wisdom before acting. Over time, this practice saves energy, reduces regret, and increases confidence. Another benefit of stillness is emotional regulation. Quiet reflection calms stress and anxiety. When you slow down, your breathing stabilizes, your nervous system relaxes, and your perspective broadens. Stillness becomes a refuge where pressure dissolves and clarity strengthens. This emotional stability strengthens resilience during challenging seasons. Sensitivity to God's voice also deepens spiritual confidence. When you experience consistent guidance, your trust strengthens. You begin to recognize patterns of God's faithfulness and provision. Your faith becomes rooted in relationship rather than uncertainty. This confidence encourages obedience even when outcomes remain unseen. Stillness invites gratitude. In quiet moments, you become more aware of blessings that noise often obscures. Gratitude softens the heart and strengthens contentment. When appreciation increases, comparison and dissatisfaction decrease. Peace becomes more sustainable because the heart remains anchored in thankfulness. Creating stillness requires intentional boundaries. Reducing unnecessary noise, limiting distractions, protecting quiet time, and prioritizing reflection are essential. Stillness does not happen accidentally in a busy world. It must be chosen deliberately. Even short moments of daily quiet can transform clarity over time. Stillness also strengthens creativity. When the mind is calm, ideas flow more freely. Insight emerges. Solutions appear. Inspiration becomes clearer. Noise often blocks creativity because the mind remains overloaded. Quiet space allows imagination and wisdom to surface naturally. Sensitivity to God's voice increases courage. When direction becomes clear, hesitation weakens. Confidence grows because you move with alignment rather than confusion. Obedience becomes easier when clarity replaces uncertainty. Ultimately, stillness is not withdrawal from responsibility, but preparation for wise action. It strengthens discernment, protects peace, deepens faith, and aligns decisions with divine wisdom. When you cultivate a quiet and attentive spirit, you gain clarity that no amount of noise can provide. In stillness, you learn to trust God's guidance more than your impulses. You move with purpose rather than pressure, and your life becomes anchored in peace, wisdom, and spiritual sensitivity. Growth rarely begins with comfort. Most people wait for confidence, clarity, perfect timing, or external validation before taking meaningful steps forward. But waiting often becomes a quiet form of disobedience that keeps potential locked inside fear and hesitation. Courage is not the absence of fear, it is the decision to move despite fear. When you choose courage over comfort, you activate the power God already placed inside you. Destiny responds to movement, not to intention alone. Comfort creates familiarity, and familiarity creates attachment. Even when comfort no longer produces growth, it feels safe because it is predictable. Many people remain in routines, mindsets, relationships, and habits that no longer align with their calling simply because change feels uncomfortable. Comfort whispers that staying where you are is safer than stepping into uncertainty. But growth always lives beyond familiar boundaries. If you never stretch beyond what feels safe, your capacity never expands. Courage begins with obedience. Often, the next step God invites you to take feels small yet stretching. A conversation you avoid, a habit you need to change, a discipline you need to establish, a boundary you must protect, a risk you must take, or a responsibility you must accept. These steps rarely come with full clarity or guaranteed outcomes, but obedience sharpens direction. When you move forward in faith, clarity follows movement. Waiting for perfect understanding often delays progress indefinitely. Fear often disguises itself as wisdom. It convinces people that they need more preparation, more resources, more confidence, or better timing before acting. While preparation is valuable, fear uses overthinking as a shield against obedience. At some point, growth requires action. Confidence grows through experience, not avoidance. Strength develops through resistance, not comfort. Faith matures through obedience, not observation. Choosing courage over comfort reshapes identity. Each time you confront fear rather than retreat, your confidence stabilizes. You begin to trust your ability to navigate discomfort. Your self-respect increases because your actions align with your values. Over time, courage becomes habit rather than exception. You stop negotiating with fear and start moving with conviction. Comfort often dulls spiritual sensitivity. When life becomes too comfortable, urgency weakens, hunger fades, and dependence on God diminishes. Challenges often sharpen prayer, discipline, humility, and spiritual awareness. Comfort can create spiritual laziness if not stewarded wisely. Courage keeps faith active and responsive rather than passive. Growth always involves risk. There is risk in obedience, vulnerability, leadership, creativity, relationships, and change. But there is also risk in staying stagnant. Stagnation slowly erodes confidence, joy, purpose, and momentum. The pain of staying the same often becomes greater than the discomfort of change. Courage chooses the pain of growth over the pain of regret. Courage also strengthens spiritual authority. When you consistently choose obedience, even when it costs comfort, your trust in God deepens. You experience his faithfulness firsthand rather than secondhand. Your faith becomes experiential rather than theoretical. This builds confidence not only in yourself, but in God's reliability. Authority grows where obedience lives. Comfort seeks convenience. Courage seeks purpose. Comfort avoids conflict. Courage confronts what needs healing. Comfort delays decisions. Courage acts responsibly. Comfort chooses ease. Courage chooses alignment. Over time, these daily choices shape destiny. The direction of your life follows the pattern of your courage. Courage does not eliminate fear. It retrains your relationship with fear. Instead of allowing fear to dictate decisions, you learn to acknowledge fear without obeying it. Fear becomes information rather than authority. You evaluate risk wisely but refuse paralysis. Emotional courage strengthens mental clarity and resilience. Choosing courage also inspires others. When people see you step forward in faith, honesty, integrity, and obedience, it gives them permission to grow as well. Leadership is often modeled rather than announced. Your courage becomes contagious because it demonstrates what is possible through trust and discipline. Courage also deepens dependence on God. When you move beyond your comfort zone, you become more aware of your need for divine guidance and strength. This humility strengthens prayer life and spiritual intimacy. You learn to trust God not just in theory, but in lived experience. Comfort often promises peace, but delivers stagnation. Courage may initially feel uncomfortable, but it produces growth, confidence, clarity, and fulfillment. Peace follows alignment, not avoidance. True peace emerges when you know you are walking in obedience rather than hiding in safety. Every meaningful breakthrough in life requires a decision to move beyond what feels familiar. Waiting for fear to disappear keeps many people trapped indefinitely. Fear often fades after obedience, not before it. The first step is often the hardest, but it opens the door for momentum. You were not created to live cautiously protecting comfort. You were created to live courageously pursuing purpose. Each courageous decision strengthens your faith muscles. Each obedient step expands capacity. Each risk taken in wisdom increases confidence. Over time, courage becomes part of your character rather than an occasional effort. Your destiny is activated when you choose movement over hesitation, obedience over fear, growth over comfort. The power God placed inside you is waiting for courageous partnership. When you step forward despite trembling, uncertainty, or resistance, you unlock momentum that transforms both your internal world and your external direction. Courage is the doorway through which dormant potential becomes active destiny.